Hi, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. This week in Parashat Yitro, we always think of the Ten Commandments, but it's really not about the Ten Commandments per se, but really about God's self-revelation to the people. After all, the first word of the Ten Commandments is God saying, Anochi, I am. And so there's this divine self-disclosure, which is both a wondrous and terrifying moment for the people. And while it's natural that usually in synagogue or in study sessions, we spend our time focusing on that moment, we neglect the story that comes before it, which is really quite enigmatic and quite rich. And of course, that's the story of Moses' father-in-law, Yitro, coming to Moses in the desert with Tzipporah and the children that she's had with Moses, and finding him and professing loyalty to the God of Israel after everything he's heard, and they share a meal together, and Yitro offers advice to Moses and serves as a kind of spiritual and leadership mentor as Yitro advises Moses in how to organize the people so that judgments can be rendered in such a way that really protects Moses and enables him to lead and sustain himself. But there's something about the story that has a very kind of haunting afterlife, because at the conclusion of this episode, it appears that Moses says to Yitro, go back, and he does, and then Moses, along with Tzipporah and his children and the rest of the people, move on. Except that's not where the story ends. There are several episodes in the Torah and afterward where Yitro reappears either with a different name or perhaps his descendants appear. And again, Moses seems to have this conversation with Yitro. We're about to leave after the census and sends him back. And then right before they enter the land, it appears that the descendants of Yitro are still there. And then in the Deuteronomic retelling of the narrative, Yitro appears again with a different name. And to add to that, there's a whole set of enigmas about Tzipporah. It says in the Torah portion that they meet up with Moshe after he has sent her away. Except the last time we saw Tzipporah and Moses together was they were returning to Egypt after meeting in Midian and having two children. And so how is it that they were together and then they were apart? That's one enigma. The other enigma is around Tzipporah's role and her power in the relationship. Because if you remember, on their way back to Egypt, there was this mysterious encounter on the road. And the whole family is threatened with death, and Tzipporah saves Moses by circumcising their son. And that's the end of the story. And so there's so many questions that arise from that story alone, so many questions that arise from where Tzipporah is and how she got to be where she is, and so many questions that arise from Yitro and his status as the priest of Midian who hears about what happens and goes to meet Moses in the desert. And for Avivah Zornberg, the great the Midrashic Jewish scholar Avivah Zornberg, these questions, and in particular, the appearance and disappearance of Tzipporah, along with a whole series of other female characters in the Torah, raise the possibility that the Torah is really two narratives, at least. There's the explicit written narrative on the one hand, and there's also the hidden narrative, of which we only see slight shards emerging through the text. And of course, the Midrashic tradition is an attempt to resuscitate that hidden narrative, perhaps that unconscious narrative. And our task is to explore these hidden moments, these lacunae in the text, and to try and bring this hidden narrative to light, or at least part of it to light in some way. And so I'm going to try and do a little bit of that in just a couple of minutes. Which means I'll only be able to do a very little bit of it. But I'll start out by saying that in rabbinic tradition, much more is said about Yitro, Moses' father-in-law, than Tzipporah, Moses' wife. And the Midrash focuses on a few important details in this early story before receiving the Ten Commandments. One is the Midrash focuses on what it was that Yitro actually heard, because he says that he heard about what God did to Pharaoh and his armies in the process of liberation, but notably, Yitro doesn't say anything about actually hearing about the revelation at Sinai. And then the rabbis go on to explore Yitro's character and his devotion, and they conclude really quite radically that he actually didn't go back to Midian, but stayed with the people, in a sense became an Israelite, in their view actually converted to be part of the Jewish people. Now, with Tzipora, the rabbis really don't say very much, but of course later in the Torah there's the striking incident in which Miriam, Moses' sister, maligns Tzipora because of her status as a Cushite woman, as an Ethiopian woman, and by implication because of the color of her skin. But then radically, what the rabbis do is actually turn that on its head and actually say that no, Tzipora was filled with these really magisterial qualities that included the darkness of her skin color. And so we have this sense of the Midrash taking these outsider characters and imbuing them with the sense that they are really paragons of what they themselves wanted to achieve in all kinds of ways, spiritually and as people in the world. So I don't obviously I don't know what the hidden narrative of the Torah is. None of us do. That's what this whole process is about. But taking these two sets of rabbinic reflections on Yitro and Tzipora, especially together, they seem to point to some enduring, haunting question about the role of the outsider and the way in which the outsider really isn't the outsider, but is really essential to who we are as we see ourselves through the mirror of the Torah. Now, interestingly, the Torah itself reflects a polemical position that this God who is transcendent in love and justice will seemingly attach God's self to the small and rather undistinguished people in order to bring that love and justice to light. Now, there's a fallacy that can come up here, that just because the Torah makes its case from the early chapters of Genesis, that this people will serve as a powerful and effective vehicle, or could, if they choose to, serve as a power and effective vehicle for the transmission of this transcendent love and justice, it does not mean that they are the only vehicles for the expression of this transcendent love and justice. And so what these midrashim and the appearance of Tzipora and Yitro do, I think, in part, is to reintroduce into the story the notion that in order to bring these transcendent values from kind of an abstract plane into actual existence, we really have to depend on people who are different from us, people whom we perceive to be the outsider. But actually, when we look more closely at the human condition, what we see is that we all share certain impulses, the impulses for awe, the impulses for that justice. We see that we are capable of a profound empathy that can overcome the tribal divisions, especially in the case of the Torah, the tribal and nationalistic divisions that are imposed upon us. And it's only through this interplay and the sense of interdependence of people who we see who are like us and people who we see who are not like us, do we actually bring this transcendent love and justice into fruition and into the reality of lived experience. And so I think this might be a part of the reason why this particular story of Yitro and Tzipora, even though it happens once and seems to be resolved in the book of Exodus, keeps coming back and haunts the Torah with this enduring question of who we are and who we are in relationship to the rest of humanity. And I think the answer can come in many forms, but one small way to do it is a way in which another great scholar, Tikvah Frymer-Kensky, has said it, which is that when we look through the lens of these stories, what we discover is that the other is us. Shabbat Shalom. Thank you for tuning in.